Hi there, and welcome to this campus webinar on how to present research to a wider audience for greater impact. I'm Laura Duckett, Content Curator of Campus, and your chair today. The job of a piece of research doesn't end in publication if it is to make a real impact, but even research with a potential to do so on a grand scale can never hope to leave its mark if it doesn't reach the right people. In this webinar, we'll discuss how to ensure that it does reach those people with the message tailored accordingly. Joining me are 4 higher education professionals from institutions in the UK and North America belonging to our Campus Plus network. Our network is made up of more than 70 institutions from across the globe. They work with our editorial team to share content, thought leadership via written resources, podcasts, videos, and webinars. If you'd like more information about all the benefits of the partnership, please visit timeshighereducation.com/campus/partners. Now a bit about the format. This webinar is an hour long, and in the last 15 to 20 minutes, I will take some questions from the audience. So please post your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Our panelists are Greg Goldsmith, Associate Dean for Research and Development at Chapman University, Christina Silva, Senior Social Media Strategist at the University of Alberta, Patricia Raun, Director of the Center of Communicating Science at Virginia Tech, and Denise Baden, Professor of Sustainable Practice at the University of Southampton. Thank you for joining me today. I'd like to now give you all a chance to introduce yourselves properly and speak a bit about your background and interest in the topic that we're discussing today. So Denise, can we start with you?
Yes, sure. Hi, well, thanks for having me on here. I've always been really interested in impact and definitely think university academics need to come out of the ivory tower. And so I'm looking forward to talking to you about some of the ways I found to try and reach a wider audience than perhaps might ever sort of read an academic article. So I'm at the University of Southampton, and I tried everything from using hairdressers to theatre to rom-coms to try and engage people in different ideas in my research.
Thanks, Denise. Sounds fascinating. Patty, can we move on to you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Patty Raun. I am the director of the Center for Communicating Science at Virginia Tech, and I'm also an actor. My background is in theater, and I grew up in a family of scientists. I was the petunia in the onion patch of scientists, and through my life, I realized that the skills of performance and improvisation could be used in a variety of ways. And over the last 15 years, I've been exploring how those approaches can be useful to folks in highly technical fields here at Virginia Tech. That's me.
Thanks. And on to you now, Greg.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Goldsmith. I'm at Chapman University in Orange, California, and I'm an associate professor of biology with a background in tropical forest ecology and global climate change. And in my current role as the associate dean for research and development, I help our faculty and our students communicate their research out to broader audiences. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And very promising to see so many different people from so many different parts of the world saying hello in the chat. I think that that gives me great hope for the future of communicating science.
Thanks, Greg. And finally, Christina.
Hi, everyone. It's the morning for me over here. I'm Christina Silva, the Senior Social Media Strategist for the University of Alberta. That's located in Western Canada. I am a non-academic person with the privilege of speaking to all of you today. I'm so thankful for this opportunity. My background is in communications and marketing, and for the U of A, my role is to work with a team of social media and communications experts on telling the amazing and incredible stories of research and innovation at our university. Our approach and our strategy comes from a very storytelling perspective, where we try to leverage all the tools available to us on the many social media platforms out there, from video to artificial intelligence to just simply posting great stories from across the university. And I'm really excited to be on this panel today. So thank you.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks all. It's really exciting to have so many speakers with so many different perspectives to share. I want to start by discussing message and audience. Patty, what are the main distinctions between engaging with an academic and non-academic audience, and how can researchers ensure that they're translating complex research into something consumable?
I guess I have three thoughts that come up when you ask that question, Laura. The first is that I don't know that there's a huge difference between academic and non-academic. The subtitle of the center that I run is The Art of Connecting Across Difference. And I think the idea is to imagine what the gap is between yourself and the communication partner that you're trying to reach or trying to listen to, and focus in on that. It may have to do with education level. It may have to do with political perspective. It may have to do with values and beliefs. So I think it's about identifying what the difference is and then leaning into that. And the second thing is to remember that everybody on the planet is an expert at something. And so the way we listen to one another with respect and knowledge of the expertise of the other person helps us find the right language. We all often talk about finding common language. The only way to find common language is to know what the experts that you are talking to care about, what they believe, and what they know. And I would say the third thing is that there is nothing more valuable than metaphor and story in terms of connecting with audiences and also conveying complex information. I think narrative, visual communication, artistic communication can often elicit a kind of spontaneous understanding that is not possible in a much more technical or balkanized way. Does that make sense? Hope so.
Yeah. Thanks, Patty. Greg, what's your take?
Yeah, I think when you think about this supposed distinction between academic and non-academic audiences, people will often say things like, well, you have to explain your research so that your grandmother can understand. And I've always found that kind of insulting for grandmothers around the world. I think that our job is to make research accessible to everyone with no presuppositions about what the knowledge of that person is. And I've always found it exceptionally compelling when someone who's an expert in the same thing that I'm an expert in can explain it to me in the most accessible of terms. And so I think that this idea that there would be two different sets of language for an academic and a non-academic audience is a little bit of a false flag. I do think that one distinction that you might think about as you're communicating your research is what you want your audience to do with that information. So what you might want one of your colleagues to do with information about a new research study that you published may be different action than what you want someone out in the community to do with that information. And that may change what information you emphasize and the ways in which you tell that story that Patty is referring to, so that you empower them to take the action that you want as a result of that communication.
And we're going to talk a bit about how to choose the way that you tell that message a little bit later. Denise, what are some of the strategies that you found effective when considering how to present your research to a wider, more general audience?
Well, for me, I was very interested to move beyond preaching to the converted, because my area is sustainability and climate change. And there's lots of people who would never dream of watching a climate change documentary, who may even actively avoid the subject. And why wouldn't you? In a way, it's quite frightening. And so I've been doing some research that shows that if you show people solutions versus show people problems, they're much more likely to actually take positive action. So like Greg says, I firmly believe, raising awareness or knowledge isn't really enough on its own. we need to give people a sense of what they can do. So, and I've done some research in business ethics research, in climate fiction, in how you present news stories. So as a result of that, I set up the Green Stories Project to try and encourage writers to embed climate solutions into their work. And so that's a way to reach a wider audience, because the idea is you can kind of almost like product place green behavior in the context of mainstream novels. So I've done a number of different projects which I think can show various ways in which I've tried to engage people. One I did with BAFTA, which is, for the Americans out there, it's the kind of our version of the Oscars. It's the British and Film Television Association. And we did a number of like Instagrams and so on, where we kind of have a little bit of fun with some of the fictional characters. And it's raising awareness of the role of fictional characters in setting what's normal and what we should aspire to. So, for example, you've got James Bond with his single-use sports car, his walk-in wardrobe of luxury suits, versus Jack Reacher, who travels by bus and shops in thrift shops. And he only uses, you know, a much lower carbon footprint to kill the bad guys than, say, James Bond. And we've got similar with Emily in Paris, who needs a Paris Agreement just for her wardrobe, versus Frankie from Frankie and Grace, who does sort of vintage clothing. So we use this as a way to kind of start the conversation about, is it okay for screenwriters to continue showing high carbon consumption as aspirational? So we found some research that shows that people are beginning to think not. So that conversation has already started. Another thing we've done is written some books. So we teamed up climate experts with experienced writers like Kim Stanley Robinson, some of you may know, Paoli Bacigalupi, to write 24 short stories, each with a climate solution at their heart. And we've done Habitat Man was one that I wrote, inspired by a local green garden consultant. It's a man who gave up his job to retire early to make gardens wildlife friendly. And I use that to smuggle in all kinds of things. So he falls in love, he digs up a body. I then talk about natural burial. And we've done some research on that with the University of Utah. And we found actually that a lot of people then change their will to specify they want natural burials without all the toxins being poured in the ground. And people took up home composting and planting, you know, pollinator-friendly plants and so on. So we showed that you can use a rom-com with a bit of cozy mystery to engage people. The latest project is a play, Murder in the Citizens' Jury. And I wrote it initially as a TV series, which won the Writing Climate Pitch Fest. And it's just put it on as a play last week, in fact. And it imagines 8 people in a citizens' assembly on climate, and they're debating different climate policies. Now, if I was writing this as an academic article, and I might look at policies such as the sharing economy or a repair bill, or on-demand public transport, or personal carbon allowances, and you would do a stakeholder analysis. How do different people engage with that? How does it affect different groups? But in the context of a play, every character is very different and approaches that idea in a different way. Some love it, some don't, some feel threatened by it. So it's a much more engaging way to get people understanding the kinds of things that might make a difference. And we asked the audience to vote on their favorite climate policy. And actually, one of the biggest climate solutions in there is the process itself. So citizens' assemblies have been shown to make longer term decisions. They're more representative, less prone to being hijacked by vested interests. So they're quite good at enabling decisions to be made that aren't constrained by tight electoral cycles. Now, so a lot of people who are into climate are also proposing greater use of citizens' assemblies. So in the UK, there's a big thing to get rid of our House of Lords, which is so antiquated, and replace it perhaps with a House of Citizens. So the play really engages the public in a number of ways in some of these ideas. So I think that's a little selection of what we've been doing and ways to try and share some of that research.
Thanks, Denise. Really fascinating, and it's proof that you can find really fun ways to kind of bring attention to these really important issues. Christina, I'd like to get your take on this too, and specifically on whether you have any tips on leaning on pop culture or trends to engage a wider audience.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the things that I'm really thrilled about with this conversation is I think this whole panel is very keen to sort of demystify the maybe like the silos between academic and non-academic communication and rhetoric. And so I'm very thrilled that we're already having this conversation, because I often find that it's like we kind of like everybody exists in the world and we are all exposed to marketing and communications. We're all we all engage and interact in different ways. And it's not as though we can we don't always have to code switch in our communications when we're trying to appeal to various audiences. And so when it comes to pop culture trends or even like jumping on trends, which seems to be the sort of the conversation du jour for us right now, from a social media and communications perspective, I think it's really important to think fast. You have to be ready to think fast. You have to be ready to balance the appropriateness of a pop culture trend and a moment with how you're communicating to your existing audiences already. And so I work with a team of social media experts at the U of A, and we're kind of constantly looking at what's happening online, what's popular, what music is functioning really well on social to try to tie it into our existing content. And sometimes because we're a university and our brand has a very specific mission, vision, and mandate, we can't lean into pop culture the way that we'd like to, or the way that other brands would like to. But we can also sometimes challenge ourselves and do those things. And I think it can be a fun way to tie your research or tie your online persona on social to your existing audience, but it can also be a way where you kind of can come across as a little bit like not at the level, or not communicating the message that you're trying to do. And if we're talking about the ways in which we can sort of innovate our communication strategies, whether you're trying to promote your academic research online on social or otherwise, I would say that leaning into traditional forms of communication on social can be effective. And so we often will try to decide if a research story or working with a researcher if video can benefit that story, or simply working with the in-house editorial team to post the news story that they've written about a specific researcher and their work might be beneficial as well. So for me, to sum it up, I would say always trying to think forward and ahead and being aware of what's happening in pop culture or what's trendy can work. And also just getting back to your basics and communicating out what you're working on is always really helpful, because folks are always hungry to learn more, to know more. And if you don't have those resources at your disposal, there's nothing that should stop you or get in the way of just like posting an article to LinkedIn, for example.
Great, thanks, Christina. Patty, part of your work involves working with STEM specialists to help them get their message across. Yeah. You've touched on it briefly, but could you talk to us a little bit more about your approach at the Centre for Communicating Science and how these professionals can get their message across and articulate?
Sure. So our approach really is fairly simple, but really challenging, because it asks people in highly technical fields to kind of unlearn some of the things that they may have learned in their graduate programs and in their special fields of study. I do 5 things all day, and if I'm not doing those 5 things, then I'm probably not doing my job. The first is to help people become more personal. And that's a very scary thing for people who've been taught to be very, very objective. The public is interested in who you are as a person, what your values are, what your beliefs are, and what you're doing and why. And the second is to help people be more direct. So to find the most direct way to communicate about your research. And the third is to help people be more spontaneous. And I kind of cringe when people say work on your elevator pitch, because what that means is you're going to memorize something that is not going to actually be about person that you're speaking to. And so the next thing is to be responsive, more interested in your audience or your communication partner is the way I prefer to think of it than an audience. More interested in your communication partner than you are in what you want them to understand, because then you'll start to discover what their curiosities are. And the fifth thing, which is kind of that I help folks unlearn, is that it's okay to bring some emotion. In fact, emotionally vivid communication is much more lasting than technically data-filled, etc. We are emotional storytelling animals, and the way to get people to open up and trust your expertise is to be human with them. Allow yourself to be vulnerable and authentic. There are lots of ways to do that. And in fact, I'm going to post at the end of our session, Research America has documented a lot of different training programs that help scientists get connected with public engagement. And I advocate getting into an improvisation class, or a theater class, or a writing class that is about storytelling. So I think those are some very practical ways that I think to become more personal, direct, spontaneous, responsive, and emotionally vivid.
Thanks, that's great advice. Just sticking to the tailoring your message theme, I want to talk about finding a hook or a way into the story that will resonate with a specific audience. Greg, could you talk to us about hooks and what your advice would be on finding that hook, and based on your work with news media?
Sure. So I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page, as it were, on what a hook is. And a hook is that opening or that introduction to the story that draws you in. So it's the first minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes of the movie that where, you know, we heard about James Bond earlier, where James Bond jumps off the top of a cliff and you don't understand what's happening, and all of a sudden the parachute comes out and you are committed to watching the rest of the movie. And you are looking for, as a researcher, a means of identifying a hook that really keeps your audience engaged, so that they get down to some of the finer details and the nuance of what you did and why it's important. And so there's no one way to do this. There are many ways to do this, and it depends on, of course, the medium that you're using, whether it's video, or whether you're doing a podcast, or whether you're writing a more traditional press release. But I certainly would suggest that you start with practicing storytelling with all of your friends. So as you're headed out to lunch with your friends, you can hang out and try a couple of different ways of telling them about what you've been doing of late, and see what sticks, see what resonates. Maybe they're excited about something that you just take for granted because you do it every day, and you didn't realize that it's so weird to everyone else around you. And that's a hint that you're onto something for the hook. A couple of questions that you can ask yourself about your research that might help you start to identify the hook. So, you know, first, of course, what do your friends think is interesting about what you're doing or what you did in your research? What makes it relevant to their lives? Why do they care? How can they connect it to their lives? And then are there ways in which what you're doing connects to other stories that are in the news? Because if it's relevant to other things that are going on, there's an enormous hurricane in the Gulf Coast of North America right now, and you happen to be working on disaster prevention plans. Your work is relevant to other stories that are in the news. And then finally, of course, I think this is where people start, but I don't necessarily think that this is where you should or always start. What about it is new? So many people have worked on, cancer biology, or many people have studied antibiotic resistance. What about your research on antibiotic resistance is new and different? And so I'll put some of these questions in the chat for folks to think about, but a hook is crucially important for engaging your audience so that you can really deliver the message that you're hoping to deliver and inspire the action that other folks on the screen are talking about.
Thanks, Greg. And it goes back to what Christina was talking about, having your finger on the pulse when it comes to trends and things like that. That can really be helpful when looking for a hook. I want to move on now to speaking about building an online profile. We've touched on this already slightly, but I want to talk specifically about how the social media landscape is changing and how that affects the way that academics operate online. So, Greg, just sticking with you for now, can you weigh in here? What do we need to bear in mind now?
Well, let me say that I'm coming from a very North American perspective, and I've seen Portugal and South Africa and India and Chile and Panama and all sorts of different places come across the screen in the chat, and so it's I need to be aware that my context differs from the context of lots of other folks on the screen. However, I generally think it's true that the social media landscape is evolving. It's continuing to evolve very quickly as companies shift in, for example, the ownership of X, or the legalities of what's happening with TikTok in the United States, et cetera. And so that is it's hard to read and predict what the future will hold there. For me, the ongoing challenge, the thing that has remained the same about social media, is how do you measure impact? And what does a view mean? And so traditionally with social media, if you're coming at it from the perspective of business, the gold standard is that social media has led to someone purchasing something. You've made money as a result of engagement in that social media. In the context of everyone involved in this webinar, we're not trying to sell a t-shirt or a widget or a product. And so understanding whether social media is going to be the most effective way to inspire the action that you want, and how you would measure that. There are measurements, folks like Christina have all of these metrics behind the scenes that they can help you understand. At the same time, I think it remains true that deep engagement as a result of social media can be very challenging.
Thank you. And Christina, as a social media expert, what's your take on this? And also, do you have any advice for building a strong online profile?
For sure. So just to spin off that, I'll mention as well. So I also have a very North American point of view on this, and our team manages organic social on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. And we also have a paid social team that runs paid social media across the gamut, across various other social media platforms as well. So just for some context there. I think my advice in terms of like maintaining a brand and establishing yourself on social is, I would start a little bit generally to say that you need to do a deep dive on your data and analytics if you can. So if you already have an existing social media presence, and let's say you're on a couple of platforms, there is no question that they have changed over time, but what you should do is try to go to the back end and figure out who your audiences are, who you're speaking to, what the demographic breakdown is. And some of the platforms will even let you know when the best time of day is to post your content. It's really hard in a space and in an industry that is changing so rapidly for us to consistently rely on things. And so I would also encourage you to be as nimble as possible, and to remember that if you're posting content onto a social media platform that has done well for you in the past, if your metrics and analytics don't serve you in the same way, you've at least done some brand awareness there. If your profile is public, you'll be Googleable, you'll be searchable in that way. And I would also recommend that as much as you can, you need to use the social media platforms in the ways that can serve you. And so the best example that I have right now is ever since Elon purchased X, we've seen such an increase in misinformation and disinformation. And I have so much empathy for folks trying to get their good work and research out on that platform, because for us in North America or in Western Canada, there was a time when X was a place where government funders, funding bodies, government officials, so many members of the public were heavily engaged in what Elon still calls the town square of the world. But the challenge is, if you're not paying to be verified, if you're in a world like for us, it's like very post-COVID, in a world of an increase of misinformation, it can be, you can spend a lot of time moderating your account. And so do what you can if you have the budget to pay to get verified on there, so you can help combat misinformation and disinformation. You know, for me as well, like the last thing I'll say is, for us, we cannot forget or let go of the power of LinkedIn specifically. There is so much accountability built into that platform for now, because everyone's resume and professional persona is attached to their commenting. And so I find that the algorithm works so well for us to get research into the right hands of folks. We find that when we post our content to LinkedIn, things can last for a bit longer than like that 24-hour churn. We're seeing engagement on posts for like 2 weeks, sometimes to a month. And so spending time to figure out who your audiences are and who you want to talk to, tailoring it to the platform, and just like I don't know if this is helpful at all, but just lean into LinkedIn, because the Briefcase app has been so good to us these days. And it might be a great place for you to find your voice and see who you can connect with.
Thank you. Patty, do you have any preferences in terms of channels, and do you have a take on how academics can use social media to greater expand their research?
I would say a couple thoughts. One is that part of the reason that we all need to learn to connect our research to a broader public is that if we don't communicate our own research, somebody else will do it for us, and probably they won't say exactly what we want to say. So I think it's useful to learn to use social media to speak for yourself, but also to be very aware of the shifting environments of the various social media platforms. We've all had some struggles with Twitter over the last several years, and I do think we're leaning more into LinkedIn because it seems to be a deeper, a more respectful environment for real communication about things that matter. So that's just a couple little thoughts that I have.
Great, thank you. Denise, I'd like to come back to your Green Stories campaigns. Could you highlight a particular campaign that serves as a good case study of how to get your message across, maybe one that did particularly well on social media? And can you talk about how it came about and what exactly it involved?
Okay, sure. I'm just trying to think, in some ways the sustainable hairdressing one might be worth a quick look, if that's all right, because that was very targeted. One of the things I wanted to do with hairdressers is they engage with more people probably than any other job in terms of chatting to people, and washing hair can be quite high impact because running hot water is one of the most energy intensive things we do. So we did a project where we called Advising Clients, where we put mirror talkers, like eco tips on mirrors, and then we got them to sort of talk about them to their customers. So for example, we'd have one where most of us use too much shampoo and shampoo too often, and then they could click on a QR code and get some information on that. So that was one where it was very targeted to people who went to the hairdresser who might not normally do that. And in terms of telling little stories, we had little posters. So for example, we had this one here where you got a story about Sam, who shampoos daily, rinses, repeat, adds conditioner. And like it's more costly, and her carbon footprint is 579 annually, compared to Joe, who shampoos twice a week, supplements with dry shampoo, uses leave-in conditioner, shampoos once rather than rinse and repeat. And hers isn't even, it's not 10% or 20% less, it's about 2,000% less, 25 kilograms. And Joe, has got good hair, plenty of time, saves money, whereas Sam takes ages to get ready in the morning. So we got little sort of profiles there. But another one that we did that I think is looking like it will really make quite a difference is, sorry, I'm trying to share again, is the hairdressing project. So because one of the things we've done with our theatre's education, the play, is we've got a QR code and on the program. So when people came to see the play set in the Climate Assembly, Murder in the Citizens' Jury, they can go on a QR code and they can find out all the different policies that are included in the story. So for example, if they're interested in citizens' assemblies, they can click on that and they can find out how they can progress the idea further, and they can find out more about it. So we're finding that a lot of people are clicking on this now, and we're going to follow up some of the metrics and see which ones people are most interested to. So for example, if they're interested in personal carbon allowances, this is something they can find out more about. There's a little video and so on. So that's something where I think a play attracts the kind of people, your kind of middle classes who go to the theatre. And they are sometimes the ones who are open to thinking about climate change, but they're probably also the ones who have quite relatively high carbon emissions. So it's a good group to engage in an entertaining way. So that's one of the ones we're making it royalty free now. So if anybody does want to put the play on, they can come to me and they can have it royalty free. And we're also going to try and stage it in places where it can have the most impact. So we talk about libraries of things, for example. We've got about 10 of those, I think, in the UK. If we stage a performance there, then the audience can think, okay, right, well, there's somewhere I can go to borrow a drill or a carpet cleaner or whatever, and not getting access to a wide market is one of the barriers these kinds of things have in being successful. So you can be quite targeted in where you put things on. And we've got a shortened version for schools as well, because a lot of schools are trying to integrate sustainability into their teaching. Most schools that will put on a play or a show, this is a nice option for them. So our first one in the school is going to be happening in December. So I'll be really interested to see how that engages people.
Thanks, Denise. So we've spoken about identifying your audience, identifying a hook, building an online profile. I want to now touch briefly on speaking to a live audience before moving on to how to work with different teams within your institution to get your message across. So Patty, drawing on your expertise and your experience in the performing arts, what are some practical things that people can do to prepare to speak to a live audience?
Well, I think just judging from my own experience today, I'm aware that speaking to a live audience brings up a little bit of anxiety. And so finding ways to address your own anxiety, maybe reframing it to think that it must be important or I wouldn't feel this way. And also to warm up your, they say approximately 93% of what is communicated is nonverbal. So warm up your body, warm up your voice, get those things going that you're going to be depending on to communicate with. Also, find opportunities to practice. Some people that I work with will spend their entire day in a lab, not speaking to anyone that they don't know, and then expect to be able to walk out on a stage and talk to 300 or 400 people without a problem. And first you have to start small. Talk to the person that's sitting next to you on the bus that you don't know. You know, that kind of incremental practice can help you get ready to speak to larger groups. Another thing that I always want folks to remember is there is no such thing as a general audience. We often talk about general audiences. Well, there isn't such a thing. There are groups of individuals who care as much about the things they care about as you care about the things you care about. They may be all sitting in one space, but they're still each going to have their own perspective. So acknowledge that and think more about their needs than about your own. In the theater, we call it pursuing your objective. Greg referred to it earlier in some of the things that he was talking about. What do they need? What are you trying to do that will change them in some way? Not about your own anxiety, about your own need to dump information into their deficit. I think we've transcended the idea of an information deficit now. But how to inspire their curiosity, I think, is the question that you ask. I hope that answers it. I think I rambled a little bit, but I think I said something in there.
Yeah, that was really great advice. Thanks, Patty. Denise, I know you give quite a lot of public talks about your work with Green Stories. Can you give us a few techniques or a bit of advice on how to overcome stage fright or imposter syndrome when presenting in this way?
Okay, so for me, I'm not sure it's really that uplifting. I mean, I loved what Patty was saying, so you know, definitely reinforce that. But for me, I find the climate crisis so scary that any nerves I have just pale into insignificance. So I don't think about myself. I'm thinking about the impact on the audience. And the nice thing, quite often, if you're dealing with other people in the sustainability field, they're really nice people. They all care about the same thing. But it can be nerve-wracking. Like when I was giving a talk on sustainable hairdressing and I went in on a bad hair day with a load of perfectly coiffured hairdressers who weren't necessarily on side with what I was saying. I think that was the most traumatic thing I'd ever had to do.
Thank you. We've got a question from a member of the audience, actually. It's what are the key ingredients for an impactful presentation? Does anyone want to take this? Does anyone have advice on this?
I think someone said it in the chat, or we've already covered it somewhere, but I think people talk about the difference between dissemination is throwing the ball and impact is someone catching it. So one of the things that people often get wrong in climate communication, for example, is thinking that if you tell people how terrible it is, you will scare them green. But they're much more likely to vote for populist right-wing leaders and like hunker down in their bunker and buy up all the toilet rolls than give up beef and flying. So I think really assuming that people will react to the knowledge in the way you assume is quite a big step. I mean, awareness and the kind of behavior you're hoping to do, there's a big gap there. So I think just don't make those assumptions. Check what actions you're helping them to do. So for example, when I wrote Habitat Man, I didn't go on about alarming statistics of biodiversity, but I did sneak in there the fact that when you're using flea treatment and vermin treatment on your dogs and cats, it is going into the earth and also taking out a lot of the ecosystem. So just to be more mindful of whether you really need to do it as often as you do. So that's something people can immediately take away and do something with, rather than, oh my God, our earth is barren and our soil is all degraded. So I think focus on agency and what people can do with it.
Great, thank you. Just quickly going to talk about how to work effectively with different teams in your institution. Greg, you work a lot with news media. That means often working with an intermediary. That for many institutions would be the media relations team. How can researchers work effectively with these teams?
Yeah, so working with news media is a fundamentally different process in some ways than working with the media relations team. And so the thing to remember for news media, because you're getting called by your local newspaper or somebody who wants to do a story on camera, is you are on demand because that member of the news media has a deadline. And so if you are being asked, you cannot wait to respond to that email or that message for 3 or 4 days. You have to respond because they need that story and they have a deadline. And if you don't respond, they will find another expert. So that's the thing to remember about news media. More generally, with the respect to the media relations team, for those of you that are at institutions that have big media relations teams, or those of you even that have no media relations team, that's okay, because what I'm going to tell you is equally applicable. And that is, you can start early. Start when that story that you want to tell is in review. Work with the media relations team to let them know when you think that story may come out. That's okay. They'll be patient. They're just happy to have the lead time to develop the strategy that they want to communicate it. You need to help them understand, I think, the 5 following questions, and I'll put them in the chat for you, and then I'll cede the floor to Christina. Who do you want to communicate to? What outcome do you want from that communication? Because communicating to your colleagues, as we said before, the outcome may be different from communicating to the public. What's the main message that you want people to take away from that story? What makes it newsworthy? Why are people going to care? And what connects it to other current stories? And if you can write just 2 or 3 sentences in response to those 5 questions, then you're going to endear yourself to everyone in that media relations office, and they're going to be so excited to have your help. And if you want bonus points with that media relations office, you might also add the types of outlets that you think would be interested and the names of journalists or bloggers or podcasters whose work you admire that is in a similar space, because you're reducing the activation energy, if I may use a term from chemistry, to help people like Christina and her team get going on telling that story.
Christina, did you want to jump in here? What advice would you give for communicating and working effectively with the marketing team?
Happy to. So again, like Greg said, this is going to vary and be dependent on the institution that you work for. But the good news about, like, I keep talking about how social is always changing, but the good news is that your marketing and communications fundamentals will not. And for us on the Central Social team, how we're housed under brand marketing, for us and my team, it's all about relationships these days. So our role centrally is to tell the stories of all of the research happening within the university through the platforms that are available to us. So when we talk about trying to leverage working with researchers and humanizing the work that you all do, we like to get you on camera. And sometimes that means, I know Patty's just alluded to this as well, it might mean that some folks are a little bit camera shy. And I am also camera shy. I have a hard time not being behind the scenes myself. And so if you feel that way, my advice would be to, if your media relations team offers media training like the U of A does, take it, say yes to it. Feel comfortable with being vulnerable with the social team and let them know that you'd like to practice if you're doing sort of a Q&A on camera with them. The work that we do on social is never live, so we will always be able to stop and start over again. Be comfortable with being vulnerable if you feel like you didn't answer a question the way that you wanted to, and ask the folks who are trying to make you look your best to the audiences you're speaking to start over. And my last piece of advice would be, and I know that this is kind of a hefty question because priorities within large institutions are always conflicting. And so there might be a news cycle or a churn in research and funding and awareness within your own lab or within your own work that doesn't line up with the news cycle itself. And so my number one tip, or my top tip, would be to keep in touch with marketing and communications as often as you can, because large institutions like the university I work for, while we sometimes feel that the news cycle is like 24 hours, you got to get in there as quickly as possible so they don't move on to another researcher. I do think there's also value in taking a second and breathing and saying, okay, we didn't make it on the 6 o'clock news. We didn't make it into the story for this national publication. But we, as the experts in this industry, as the institution with the funding and the research to do this work, can speak to this and then publish within your social channels, work with your editorial teams to get your work out there, and then do your best to work with media relations and social to then bring that story back into the news cycle. It's a challenge to do because I think sometimes we feel like we need to say yes to the institutions that are in place. Like a journalist calls you and you got to get back to them. Absolutely do that when you can. But remember that you can step into your power as the experts in your industry to come back and be prepared to give them the story and the hook that you've worked on to get yourself back into the news. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thanks. We've had a question in about research being taken out of context. Just sticking with you, Christina, is there anything that you could do to mitigate this, or what kind of damage control has to be done when this sort of thing happens?
Yeah, honestly, let me start by saying that's got to be so frustrating. We often have, like, sometimes some of the work that we do at the university can be misconstrued or misinterpreted or weaponized to fulfill other audiences that might be looking for that information in kind of a negative or pejorative way. And so my recommendation would be to moderate your comments as much as possible. Be prepared with a response and work with folks, or like lean on people to help you with that so that you can provide the correction that is needed. Take a second. If you see that something is going viral for the wrong reasons, or if your research is being misinterpreted in the wrong way, that is really frustrating. And I really sympathize with the need to kind of like that knee-jerk response to say you're wrong and that's incorrect, but really take a second to get your key messages in order and think about how you want to reply, because there's power and value in that. And I will always, and just like, this may be anecdotal, but like vent to people, talk it through. That sucks so much. It's so frustrating in this economy of attention spans for that to happen. But I really believe in the fundamentals of marketing and communications work that never changes. Just always come correct and just step into your power where you can.
Great, thanks, Christina. Patty, I want to ask you, there's another question here from an audience member. Do you think it's important to communicate research methodology and to demonstrate the complexity of the science to the public?
I believe it certainly is important in the context, not in every context. And it depends again on your objective. So are you trying to get someone to open up to you and to become curious about your work? Then the complexity may need to wait until they ask you a question. But certainly in the world that we all live in our bubbles, we're going to be dealing with the complexity and the technicalities all the time. But I think to be very aware of yourself, to be aware of the environment, to be aware of the situation, and the curiosities of your communication partner are essential. I'm going to put a bunch of stuff in the chat, and I'm going to start doing that right now before our hour ends. So please forgive me as I start loading it.
Great. Denise, do you demonstrate the methodology of your research on your Green Stories campaigns, and do you think there's any benefit to doing that?
Only in the most general of way, to be honest. I save that mostly for the academic articles. So I just think when people are scrolling websites, they've probably got quite limited attention, and I just want to make sure that I'm focusing it on the bits that are important takeaways, with maybe a sort of read more by following this link kind of thing. So they can choose to follow up, but I don't present it all up front.
Okay. And another question here, any tips or tricks to use to increase followers or increase engagement on social media? Christina, can we go to you?
For sure. That's a really hard one, and it's changed over time. 10 years ago, I would have said, you just got to create an account and start following people and they'll follow you back. But the days of that are done, and the algorithms don't work chronologically. They work to try to get to know your user behaviors. So what I would say is focus on what you want to tell your audience, get to know your audience, and if you have the budget and capacity to do so, engage in paid social advertising, because that is where you have, if you can work with the institution that you have, or if you have folks on your team who can do paid marketing on social, that's where you can really harness the power of targeting audiences to get your message out there. And just remember that the social media platforms that we work with are primarily advertising platforms. And so it is a pay to play ecosystem, as much as that can be very frustrating for all of us who just really want to believe in the earnestness of communicating openly and honestly to audiences. But every day I have to remind myself that billionaires own these platforms and we have to use them to the best of our abilities to communicate our message. And there's always a very special dance involved with that. So those are my tips.
Thanks. We've got another question here. Do you have any guidelines or resources we could use to make our research accessible? So I'll just invite you all to, if you do have any resources, to just paste those into the chat now. But we are out of time now, so I would like to thank you all so much for joining today. And please do head over to campus to find more useful advice and insight on how to reach a broader audience with your research at timeshighereducation.com/campus.